way the cost of fertiliser has gone over the last number of years, and I suppose people are obviously very conscious of not wasting it and not applying it in kind of suboptimal conditions when grass growth isn't, I suppose, sufficient enough to uptake the nutrients. What I think where we need to go to is to thinking of slurry in almost the exact same way. We have to kind of come away from this thing of we'll just apply it now because the open period is there.
Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy Podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. As we prepare for the slurry spreading season, Pat Tuohy from Teagasc and William Burchill from UCC join us to discuss the where, when and how much slurry to spread this spring and costings of storage investment. And first, William explained why there is a close period for slurry spreading.
The close period varies across the country, and Ireland has been broken down into 3 zones, and people will be familiar with these. So look in Zone A, which is kind of down in, let's say, Cork County side of the country, that has a closed period for slurry from the 13th of January to the 30th of September this year. And Zone B then is the 16th of January to the 30th of September. And Zone C, which will be up in Cavan Monaghan area, that has a closed period from the 1st of February to the 30th of September. So look, it varies across the country in terms of which zone you are, in terms of the length of the slurry close period. And it's important that, look, we adhere to the slurry close period because really, all of the science that's been done on this is very clearly showing that during this period of time is the key risky period in terms of nutrient loss from lands to water. So look, this time of the year is very typical in terms of lower soil temperatures, lower grass growth. So, when we don't have grass growth, there isn't going to be the capacity to take up nutrients that are applied. So that's one factor. And the other factor then is that you also have a period of the year where you're having excess rainfall. And again, at this time of the year, every bit of water that's falling on soils now is starting to percolate down through the soil profile. And any nutrients that are being applied, they're not going to be taken up by grass, and they're vulnerable then to be, I suppose, flushed or washed down through the soil in terms of, driving nutrient losses to water. So it's something we have to be very careful and conscious of. Even if we do get a dry period of weather within the closed period, there still isn't going to be a major level of nutrient uptake in the herbage. So again, those nutrients will sit there, and if you're getting a heavy rainfall, even if it's a week or 2 later, there's a very high risk of those nutrients being lost. So that's the main reason why the closed period is there. And a lot of the work that's been done, especially through the catchments program, is clearly showing that it's the high risk period. So we must be conscious of that, and we must ensure that we do not spread during this closed period.
And to you, Pat, based on the dates that William has presented to us, people are in the situation where anywhere in the next week to 3 weeks, they're allowed to get out with slurry on the land. So at this point, under pressure, perhaps, in terms of slurry storage, the reality for many farms is there's more slurry storage needed. If we look at the main options from an Irish context, what are the types of slurry storage that people are investing in, and maybe with each specific one, what are the costs associated with each?
Yeah, absolutely. There is an element of pressure there, in some cases more than others. So there needs to be in consideration in terms of relieving that pressure. The direct route to relieve that is to increase the capacity that we have in the yard. So look, there was recently an analysis done in terms of cost for a number of different options. The first option that we had was a slatted tank, a 9 foot deep by 16 foot wide, was coming in at about €450 per foot of length. And just for round figures, then we calculated for a 200 cow herd, and for a 20-week close period, as William said, it ranges from 16 to 22 weeks. So we took a round number in the middle there, just so people can adjust accordingly. But that was coming in at about €790 per cow. an overground tower with a cover and an agitator and a reception tank was coming in at the other side of €800, €835 per cow. So similar. The other option then, which is an option in some cases, is the slurry bag option, which is suited to dilute slurry with less than 4% dry matter, and that's a cheaper option at €325 per cow. So as I said, it's a consideration certainly for some people who are under pressure as we speak, and who are looking maybe into the future to say how we might offer or reduce that pressure in upcoming winters or upcoming closed periods.
And Pat, out of those three options, your slatted tank, overground tower, and the slurry bag, what do you see as the preferred option for dairy farmers in Ireland?
It depends on the circumstances. Each are suited to their own particular cases. I suppose it's horses for courses. As I said, the slurry bags is a cheaper option, and it's suited to more dilute slurry. The other two are much of a muchness then in terms of cost, and depending on space requirements, or depending on, the slatted tank will obviously allow for additional housing if that was to be roofed and cubicles and everything else added in. So again, depending on the other pressures that might be there, those options will suit different people at different times.
And I guess to both of you, I was at your session at the recent National Dairy Conference in Kilkenny, and I suppose there was a debate and a good conversation with the crowd in terms of the availability and the requirement of slurry storage, but how soon you get out and when to get out. So maybe first to you, William, like a comment on that, and how should we be managing slurry in the coming weeks?
What we traditionally would have done is, we would have applied slurry maybe as soon as possible after the closed period opened. And that'll obviously vary again across the country. But like one thing I think we need to start thinking about really in terms of the way we manage our slurry is you kind of have to ask yourself the question, if I wasn't prepared to go out with bag fertiliser today, like should you be prepared to go out with slurry? In terms of getting a good response and a good efficiency from the nutrients within that slurry. We'd often see that farmers will chance going with slurry first. They'll take the chance with that, whereas they will usually hold off with fertilizer because, again, we see the way the cost of fertilizer has gone over the last number of years, and I suppose people are obviously very conscious of not wasting it and not applying it in kind of suboptimal conditions when grass growth isn't, I suppose, sufficient enough to uptake the nutrients. What I think where we need to go to is to thinking of slurry in almost the exact same way. We have to kind of come away from this thing of we'll just apply it now because the open period is there. I think we have to kind of utilize it and think of it in the exact same way as we think of chemical fertilizer, and just look to even kind of put a value on it. 2 or 3 years ago, slurry was worth around €20 per 1,000 gallons if we looked at the nitrogen, potassium and phosphorus within it. But the value of slurry has actually increased almost twofold. When the fertilizer prices were at their peak, that was somewhere close to €40 per 1,000 gallons. At the moment now, it's somewhere around the €30 to €35 per 1,000 gallons mark. So, it's a significant source of nutrient on the farm. And for a lot of farms, it may be the actually only source of phosphorus that we actually have available to us. For some farms that are in irrigation, and if they have, maybe reasonably good levels of phosphorus in their soil samples already, they won't have an allowance for phosphorus. So, the only actual nutrient source for phosphorus on some farms will only be in the slurry that they have. So, we really have to make sure that we make use of it and that it's applied in the appropriate time and the appropriate place to get the maximum benefit from it.
And on that, Pat, I mean, it's a good point William makes in terms of are you prepared to go with your bagged fertilizer? If not, should you be going with your slurry? But in terms of, I suppose, customizing it or, field specific, has the trend moved away from, I know this is a dry field, I need to get out with slurry, is it moving more towards, I know where the fields that require the slurry?
Yeah, to a certain degree that the movement is in that direction, but I suppose we need to move more quickly in that direction. I mean, William has said a lot there in terms of the nutrient value, but I suppose the flexibility or lack thereof is the issue. When it comes to mid-January, the pressure is on, and it's a matter of getting rid of a problem in terms of a burden, and you've no other option only to empty the slurry tank. Whereas with appropriate capacity and appropriate storage and scope for what William was talking about in terms of are you willing to spread bag fertilizer versus slurry, if the flexibility is there, you have capacity to use the resource for all it's worth, as opposed to seeing it as a burden and something to be gotten rid of in mid-January. And you're forced then, as you said, Emma-Louise, into the drier parts of the farm. Whereas you've more scope to go to all parts of the farm if you have capacity to push beyond that mid-January time of the year or what have you. So it's all about options, I suppose, or flexibility and making use of the slurry as opposed to having it as a burden or a problem to be dealt with when the time comes in terms of when the close period ends.
William, you mentioned, perhaps €40 per 1,000 gallons of slurry, as it stands in recent years, given the price of bagged fertilizer. But I guess, given what Pat has mentioned in terms of the variability, if unroofed slurry versus roofed, and also the different types of stock that are in sheds, be it a dry cow, a milking cow, growing stock, or finishing animals. Can you talk us a little bit about the variability that you could expect in terms of your NP and K profile, depending on the type of storage and the type of animal that the slurry is being collected from?
A long number of years ago, Teagasc would have gone out onto a large number of farms and tested slurry across numerous farms, systems, different enterprises, different sheds, different tanks, and so forth. And like the values that we've been using as an average value for the last number of years is that 1,000 gallons of slurry will deliver around 9 units of nitrogen, around 5 units of P, and 32 units of potassium. And that's an average value that we've kind of been using for a long number of years. But like you said, Emma-Louise, there's a huge amount of variability around that. So just by way of an example there, a few years ago, I did a bit of a slurry testing campaign with a number of farmers in the Dairy Gold catchment area. And a major thing that we found was that there was massive variability, particularly based on the type of tank that the slurry came out of. So like what we generally found was the more covered the tank was, the higher the dry matter the slurry was. And as a result, then you had higher nutrient contents. For example, we had some slurries coming back in at closer to 12 units of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons. Whereas, in maybe more open tanks or even say open towers or even in lagoons, that nitrogen content could be down to maybe 6 or 7 units of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons. So, almost a twofold difference in the nutrient content depending on the type of tank and literally, I suppose, how much water is actually getting into the tank and what level of dilution is there. So that was one factor. And another thing that we saw as well was particularly for some of the farms where they had say a group of stock of finishing stock, maybe finishing bulls, and were feeding a good level of concentrates. We often saw that the phosphorus contents in those slurries were actually significantly higher than the average value of 5 units per 1,000 gallons that we would have had associated with slurry. So, like what we kind of found from that campaign is that even within the same farm yard, slurry from 2 different tanks could be quite different. So, I think one thing that can really be done is to look at going off and actually testing your slurry this coming winter. From the farms that have done it, they found it to be a very useful tool. Like just some of the very practical things that people have done with the information is that they'll find the slurry that has the highest P and K content in the yard. And that's generally the slurry with the highest dry matter. And they're typically just saving that slurry and using it for their silage ground. So they're maximizing the recycling of P and K back onto their silage ground, or even onto ground as well. Obviously, that's low in index 3 or low in indexes for P and K as well. So now they're making better use of that. And then perhaps a tank in the yard that's that little bit more dilute will have a little bit less P and K and nitrogen in it. They're typically applying that on the grazing platform. So that's obviously helping in terms of washing and reducing the contamination on the grass. And also as well, the fact that animals are grazing on the grazing platform, there's a lot of recycling in the dung and urine on the field. So those fields typically don't have as high a demand for P and K. So, there's some really simple things, and even the most practical thing is it's really given people who've tested an appreciation for what's actually in the slurry. And really helping them to guide where to put it, and even helping them to better judge, the application rate that they apply the slurry at.
And William, John and Brendan Walsh would have introduced me to the practice of slurry testing late last year, and I guess that's potentially from that's a William Burchill effect maybe with the slurry test campaign. But I suppose to give people guidance, when do you do the test? I suppose the length of time from testing to results and the cost of doing it.
Yeah, so the best timing for it, Emma-Louise, is literally the first time you agitate the tank after the winter to go spreading. So what's really important is that the slurry is really well agitated so that you mix up the crust and the liquid part at the bottom. That's very important. And then, obviously you have to be extremely careful when you're doing this. Usually what farmers are doing is they'll spread 2 or 3 loads of slurry. Then the 4th or 5th load of slurry, they'll take out, suck out a load of slurry and literally it's a dirty job, open the back hatch of the tank just for a split second into a bucket. And typically you pour about half a litre of slurry then into a sealed container, and then that can be posted off then to, the majority of the labs in the country that do soil testing will test slurry as well. So timing wise, it's the first time you agitate the tank. Half a litre of slurry must be well agitated, and cost wise, you're talking around somewhere between 50 to 60 euros plus VAT. So maybe, with VAT on top of it, it's probably 70 or 80 euros a sample. But look, if your system doesn't change that much from year to year, that test can be quite representative for a number of years. And, given the cost of fertiliser, it's a very small cost overall.
And to you, Pat, I suppose looking at another aspect of slurry storage, you were working on a project with 100 dairy farms across Ireland, and you're measuring volumes of slurry and dairy washings. Now, while you're in the early days and you don't have multiple years of results to present to us, can you explain the reason for this work?
Yeah, so that's an ongoing project. We were asked to do it, I suppose, in summer of 2022. There was discussions around this issue in terms of the current regulations and the allowances that are there in terms of capacity. And it was funded and set up then in October of last year. So it's a 2.5 year project. It'll be running until April 2025. So in truth, I suppose we have a fairly short lead into last winter and the close period. So we had a few farms set up, but now we're in the real heart of it, I suppose, this winter and next winter in terms of, all the 100 farms set up. So they're spread across the country. And the question is around volumes of dairy soil water and slurry being produced on those farms. The current allowances or capacity is that's allowed for is 30 litres per cow per day for soiled water and 48 litres per cow per day for slurry, plus an allowance for any runoff from uncovered yards, and so on. So the monitoring program is measuring volumes collected in those 100 farms. It's looking at all the inputs then in terms of stock numbers and the management of that stock, in terms of what stock relates to which tank, the routine around washing and parlour details, and the size and type of parlour, and as I mentioned, any uncovered areas or runoff areas or silage effluent or anything else that may be contributing to the total volume being collected, as well as a scheme of sampling. So we'll be testing all those tanks, as William has described, in terms of getting a view on what's happening in terms of constituents for pH, NPK, and dry matter. So yeah, we're in the heart of that work, and it'll be, I suppose, we'll have a fairly solid basis to work off kind of after this winter, but really and truly the full picture will be there after 2 winters or 2 years of this, I suppose, both the slurry and the soil water question. So it's in the pipeline, but it'll be coming in the next couple of years.
And I think your point, Pat, on the multiple years is important because, I suppose depending on where you are in the country, people are very happy with the level of rainfall this year, and there was the lack of drought or dry spells on the farm, and then conversely other farmers were under pressure. A point that a lot of advisors would make when they're out on farm is looking at channels and I suppose harvesting or diverting rainwater away from slurry tanks. Does that have a major contributing factor to levels of slurry that's accumulated across the entire year?
Yeah, and we're looking, I suppose, at a lot of raw data that's there now, but that's something that's quite visual, especially in the year that's in it. We've had lots of very heavy rain since late June, early July, really. So we're 6 months into that at this stage or more. So that is showing up tanks that are more exposed to rainfall versus those that are better covered or better isolated from runoff. Not just in terms of roofing or covering, but what's running off other adjacent yards or adjacent areas is quite clear in some tanks when you're getting a wet few days or a wet week or what have you. So that's something I think that's quite clear already from the information that we're collecting, and we'll be able to establish exactly in different parts of the country what that effect is as the project develops.
If we look at, I suppose, the date we're sitting down today, as we say, we're going to be out with slurry in the coming weeks. Maybe from each of you, your top 1 or 2 tips in terms of maximising the value you're going to get from your slurry this spring. To you, William.
Yeah, so Emma-Louise, I just say to people that they must remember that up to 80% of the nutrient value in their slurry is from the P and K. And just a very quick guide on that then to maximise your use of slurry is how you're going to spread it. So first of all, being the technique, maybe using trailing shoe or dribble bar, and that'll maximise the nitrogen value. Where in terms of where you're going to spread it, your silage ground or your low index P and K ground. And also as well, how much as well, getting the application rate right for the appropriate field, whether it is for silage ground or for grazing ground. That's very important, and actually testing will actually help you inform your decision on that. And
to you, Pat?
Yeah, William has covered most of it there, to be honest. Emma-Louise, I suppose the other thing in light of my work or the stuff we've discussed is to be aware of that runoff issue and rainwater getting into tanks and the dilution effect that's there. And as I said, it's quite clear looking at the data that we're building where that's an issue. So again, just simple things in terms of diverting runoff, being aware of it as an issue. And making sure that contribution isn't being added, and in weeks, and we've seen plenty of them where you're getting 5-6 inches of rain in a couple of days or in a week. If that's falling on a large area and is finding its way into exposed or open tanks, that's a significant additional capacity that's being used up, and it's diluting the slurry that's there in terms of affecting the nutrient value of it. So that would be very much something to keep an eye on.
Thank you, Pat and William. I think the conversation has been interesting. We're dealing with 2 different dynamics here. We obviously have the short term. We're getting out with slurry this spring, and I suppose you've both identified how we can do that, to add value to the farm, but also, particularly your information that you've provided, Pat, in terms of costing of various investments in slurry storage, looking at that longer term view, looking at, making slurry a valuable resource on farm rather than a problem in the first few weeks of the opening period. Pat and William, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Pat Tuohy and William Burchill for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review, and listen on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.